Hello everyone, my name is Reese Lindmark and you're listening to Gray Mirror, a podcast from MIT Media Lab's Digital Currency Initiative on technology, society, and ethics. And unlike something like Black Mirror, which just looks at the negative impacts of technology on society, we are Gray Mirror, so we look at the positive and negative impacts of technology on society. And please, if you have any feedback, reach out on Twitter, and if you like the show, give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app. We really do appreciate it. Thanks. So today I have a super interesting chat with Anand Giridharadas about his new book, Winners Take All. And it's a book about how elites are keeping their power and the ways and mechanisms in which they do so. And it's a very hip book these days because lots of society is based around this now. You have lots of income inequality, you have tax policies in America pushed by Elizabeth Warren and AOC to kind of counteract this. You have, a billionaire like Howard Schultz running for president. You have lots of billionaire pushback at Davos. So it's a very apropos book for the moment right now. And Anand and I chat about a variety of different things: the mindset towards philanthropy versus taxes, billionaires more generally, solutionism versus just exposing the problem, effective altruism, and this balance between thinking locally and globally. And we also chat about tech escapism as manifest through something like cryptocurrency. But I want to highlight kind of four. So listen to the episode if you want to hear all those things. But I want to just highlight 4 big pieces now for a little bit more in-depthness at the beginning. So the first is Anand does a really great job of saying, hey, our current system is not objectively true. It's just one of many possible worlds. So right now we have a certain value capture system that made it the case that Mark Zuckerberg owns 25% of Facebook and is worth $60 billion. That is not objectively true. That does not have to be the way things are. Instead, that is the result of our the shareholder equity system applied to this world of the internet and aggregation theory and things like Google and Amazon and Facebook and the Silicon Valley mindset of black swans and 1,000x returns and founder worship. And so because of that, someone like Mark Zuckerberg is worth 50 billion instead of 50 million. But that didn't have to be true. You can imagine a world in which he only made $50 million, in which the value capture mechanisms that we have in society are distributed in a different way. So that's a very helpful mindset to say, these days, our current value capture mindset is just one of many possible worlds, and we can escape it and exit it to a different world that has a different value capture mindset that might not allow for billionaires to exist or might have different kind of mechanisms in place. So that's one mindset to think about that I think is super crucial. The second thing is that although Anand and I agree on a variety of things, I think we disagree on what to do next. So in this question of individual responsibility. So after you read Anand's book, and if you take it as true, which I generally do, what should we do about it? What should an individual do? How can you make billionaires get taxed more? And I think Anand says, hey, you should engage within your political process and try to influence that process. And for me, just with my personal experience with that and seeing it as it is, it's like I'm worried about matching my circle of influence to my circle of concern, in the sense that for me, I've felt that engaging in the political process can be kind of sad, and I really love just the idea of taking individual responsibility for one's actions. And so for me, this means like a self-tax system where you give money to charity, even if you're not a billionaire, even if you're someone like me who makes $70,000 a year, to give 20% of that to charity or whatever. So I think that this is a difference between us, and one that you should ask yourself is, if you take this as true, and if you want there to be no more billionaires in the world, or you want them to give more of their money away or for it to be taxed more, how should you make that happen? Should it be through political processes or through kind of individual responsibility-based norms processes? So that's the second point. The third point here is kind of another distinction here, which is this difference between taxes and charities, but they're both ways to support the public good. And I think that, Anand and I chat a lot about, the pros and cons of each, and you can think of them as taxes are something that's decided by the government, both the percentage that you're taxed and where it goes, and it's enforced. The enforcement mechanism is law. That's different than something like giving, where it is decided, the amount that you give and where you give it is decided by individuals, and it's enforced by norms. And so think about the pros and cons of the government-based taxing and the self-based giving and tithing system as you listen. And finally, the fourth piece here is one of Anand's highlights in the episode and also in the book, and one of his main theses, is that you have people doing bad things on one hand and then paying it off with the other. Actually, a great example of this is within the effective altruist community, this example of earning to give, where you go and work in the oil fields or, at a financial institution, and then you make lots of money, and then you give it to these super effective charities, and then the claims that you still had a very positive impact on the world. And that kind of feels intuitively kind of gross, but it has relatively fine consequentialist backing. And so the macro question for you to ask yourself is, how much should we be able to pay off our sins? And another way to say this is, should we, if we assume that that we exist in late stage capitalism, in this market world, in our current system as it is, should we try to change that system? Or should we allow that system to exist to some extent and then create a parallel process to pay off its externalities and to redistribute wealth? So that's a big question here, is how much should we and should our processes be allowed to purely optimize for one thing and then pay it off with the other hand? Or how much should we make the process itself one that has the ends and the means kind of baked into one? So with that, I hope you enjoyed today's episode with Anand, and I'll see you next time. Hello, everybody. You're listening to Gray Mirror. Anand, thanks for being on the show and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, excited to dive in. So first, for our listeners, could you just give a high-level, quick overview of Winners Take All and what your main thesis in the book is?
Winners Take All is my attempt through reporting to answer a question I had, a question that grew out of observing a paradox that every listener of this podcast has probably noticed, which is that on the one hand, we live in this age defined by extraordinary elite generosity, whether you're at a place like MIT, where, so many young people want to make a difference, give back, help the poor, empower the forgotten, or you look at the richest people in the world who right now are giving away more money than has ever been given in the history of the world. Or you look at every company, including the ones that advertised in the Super Bowl the other night. I mean, you almost can't run a company in America today that says you're just trying to make a decent return and return money to shareholders. You have to say you're cleaning the water, you're empowering women, you're fighting for justice, you got your CSR thing, you got your foundation. And yet, despite living in an age of extraordinary elite generosity, what the numbers tell us, and what anyone who does what I do, which is reporting, will tell you, who goes to those communities, as I have for years, this is also a time of staggering inequality, of wage and frankly life stagnation in large parts of this country. It is has been a punishing time to be a working middle class person in this country, and frankly many other countries. And so I began the reporting journey with curiosity about what the relationship is between all these rich people, elites, saying that they're making the world a better place, changing the world, and doing all of that, doing well by doing good, and why it is that sits uneasily next to the reality of a cruel winners-take-all economy and society. And what I found at the end of a reporting journey, embedding myself in that world, I went on a cruise ship with 3,000 entrepreneurs so that you didn't have to. I spent time with people in the philanthropy worlds, tech worlds, and other of these worlds. And what I found was, I think, something very disturbing. Not just that all this elite helpfulness is inadequate, which I think we would all generally agree that it's not moving the needle fast enough against the big shared problems we have, but that actually, in many cases, elite generosity is part and parcel of upholding a flawed system that is causing those problems on a much bigger scale than elites could ever help through private generosity. In other words, that the kind of making a difference that we see is the wingman of making a killing. And the kind of giving back that we see is the wingman of continued and frankly unjust levels of taking. And I came to the conclusion after reporting this book that the whole rhetoric and practice of changing the world when pursued by plutocrats in a society that is increasingly a plutocracy has the appearance of a kind of progressive egalitarian globe, but is in fact a form of conservative elite self-defense.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I think that's beautiful. I think it is very. I mean, it just rings so true, and I think you state it in a very good way. And the book goes into a lot of detail on it. And I think that you're correct also to think of it from a systems perspective, to say that the system perpetuates itself. And that something that we talk about a lot on this podcast is the idea of paradigms and systems, and how you have, if you want to change a system, you can change like some smaller parts of the system, like specific laws or specific incentives or whatever, but you can also go to the kind of the system level or the paradigm level and say, hey, let's actually think about this from a paradigm perspective. And if we change the paradigm, then that paradigm can actually change the norms or the incentives or the laws or whatever. So do you kind of agree that and you call it like the market world, this plutocracy that we live in? Do you think that, would you agree that it's like you see it as this like massive kind of big paradigm, and then everything in the world is kind of manifest as a version of it? And if so, how is it manifest? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, maybe one way to end to that is, I start the book with a couple of quotes, and the first one is from Tolstoy, and the line is, "I sit on a man's back, choking him, and making him carry me, and yet assure myself and others that I am sorry for him, and wish to lighten his load by all means possible, except by getting off his back."
Yeah.
And I think the position of many of the winners of our age, an age of transformative innovation, of extraordinary growth, of immense prosperity, many of the winners of our age find themselves in the lamentable position that Tolstoy describes because of the system that you described. They are standing, they have won their victories. They have the billions they do. They run the companies they do. They live in the places they do, not just because they're geniuses, but because of certain social arrangements that have allowed them to win and others not. Right? If opportunity was perfectly evenly distributed, Silicon Valley would, be a lot less white, be a lot less male. And so it's hard to avoid the conclusion that the system we have, which frankly has allowed 82% of new wealth created in 2017 to be cornered by the global top 1%, that's allowed the top 1% in the United States to double their share of the nation's income since the middle of the 20th century, that those kinds of system rigging changes have made it great to be an elite, great to live in the Hamptons or Marin or Westchester or Evanston, but have made it harder to be, anybody else. And the elites that I'm talking about are usually not bad people. They want to help. They want to do something. They see what I'm saying, and they want to respond. But what they're unwilling to do is concede the system itself. They're unwilling to concede the tax system that advantages investment income over regular laboring income. They're unwilling to concede a system that lets you have better public schools if you live in Greenwich, Connecticut in a big house than if you live in the south side of Chicago in a cramped apartment. They're unwilling to concede the kind of changes that would make maternity leave a right and cost them billions and billions of dollars in government taxation. They're unwilling to have the kinds of changes that would give Americans health care without having to think about health care every day, but would, again, cost them lots of money. But what they're interested in doing is continuing to stay on our backs, and instead of saying nothing, doing nothing, throwing down small scraps of pseudo change that create the feeling that at least they're trying to help.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's interesting, and I agree at a high level, which is that they hear what you're talking about. They say, "Oh man, I agree with you, and I see some of these things as issues," but then kind of from the macro perspective, they're unwilling to kind of take the actions, like the daily actions, the daily mindset changes to remove some of the power from themselves, or to distribute or redistribute that power. Do you think? So, what would you? I mean, if you think about, so for someone like me, and there's kind of some awkwardness here where like I work at MIT and I watched a clip where you were talking at Google. I am clearly, very clearly, part of the elite from the upper class in America, white, straight male. how should I, or let me give you an example. For me personally, what I do is I like tax myself, self-tax myself. I tithe myself 20% of my income and give it back to various things. And that's not very much, but that's me trying to take your book to heart and to say, hey, I'm trying to do something about this. I'm trying to say, me as an elite, I don't need any more. I clearly have enough. I want to start to give back. Is that a good attempt, or what kinds of things would you like to see from people, from the elites of the world, say, hey, they actually are moving the needle at this macro systemic level?
Well, first of all, I think people, regular people being generous is great. I mean, I'm not an opponent of that. What Martin Luther King said so well that philanthropy itself is commendable, but we can't overlook the circumstances of economic injustice that make it necessary. So it's not that individual acts of giving are problematic, although some individual acts of giving are problematic because they actually obscure things that cause much greater harm. But in general, yeah, it's good to give. But I think a lot of giving, when pursued by plutocrats on a very big scale, and I'm talking about $3 billion to implement my vision of public education, or $4 billion to do this or that. A lot of that kind of giving, something a little more complicated is going on than we often realize. And yes, there's a genuine and noble effort to help. However, there's a couple other things that often happen, and I'll highlight three in particular. One, the thing people often ask me is like, well, what could be wrong with trying to do good? And the answer is when that good abets harm on a greater scale than the good that it's doing, right? So here's a couple ways that kind of giving back can abet harm. There's a kind of erasure where a relatively modest amount of giving can actually kind of scrub your name, scrub your reputation, and create space for you to keep doing harm, or for harm you did in the past to sort of not rise to the attention of journalists and regulators. A very simple example of that, in your part of the world and mine and elsewhere, is the Sackler family, the family behind the opioid crisis, a crisis that has killed 200,000 plus people. Those are, genocide numbers of deaths, ravaged communities. I've been to those communities. They look like physically ill communities. I mean, the whole place has been ravaged in many cases by this scourge. And you have a family that developed that drug, made billions of dollars pushing that drug, pushed it aggressively in the face of evidence that it was hurting people, and faced some criminal investigations around it, pled out to some. None of this is in dispute. They admitted that they fraudulently marketed the thing, minimized risks. Thousands and hundreds of thousands of people died as a result of their and other related drugs. But they were really the primary instigators. And what were they doing all the while? Philanthropy. They were giving money back. Harvard Sackler Museum, right? You got Sackler galleries in the Smithsonian. You got Sackler at the Guggenheim. You got Sackler here, there, and everywhere. Sackler, Sackler, Sackler. And what it did was it bought off the intelligentsia. For years and years and years, people knew the Sacklers were sort of this art-related family, and no one really associated them with creating the opioid crisis, even though all the evidence was there. Even though the Department of Justice complaint was available on the web. So that's one way in which giving might actually leave us all worse off, because I think we might actually have been in a better place if they'd never given that arts money. Yeah, we would have had a little fewer paintings, but I think we may have saved thousands of lives if journalists and regulators and political leaders had been less kind of distracted and gone after them sooner. I think another example, that's Mark Zuckerberg, by the way. I think if Mark Zuckerberg had no moral glow as a change agent and guy giving all his money away and whatever, who knows how much he's actually even given so far. If he didn't have that glow, if he was just seen the way any, a chemical magnate is seen or a shipping magnate is seen, you think people would have let him get away with what they let him get away with? You realize, like, Martha Stewart went to jail for what? Like, stock at a party? I mean, like, I'm not excusing insider trading, but the idea that Martha Stewart went to jail jailed at hard time, and Mark Zuckerberg, who's been seriously accused by very serious people of possibly altering a federal election result, and at the very least valuing his own right to be left alone over what was an act of foreign cyber war.
Mm-hmm.
That guy's roaming around, telling everybody about changing the world.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another way in which this kind of change can kind of leave us all worse off, because actually it obscures what people do. Then there's the fact that this kind of change making, even if you're a good guy who doesn't do that kind of stuff,
Mm-hmm.
if you're spending $3 billion transforming our schools, who are you to transform our schools?
Mm-hmm.
There's a second objection that's just the objection from democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Why did people die in this country to ensure one person, one vote? If we create this other door to the nightclub of democracy where only billionaires can walk in and they each get 1 million votes,
Mm-hmm.
what's the whole point of enforcing voting rights if there's just this other way for some people to dictate public policy? Which is what you're doing when you're pushing something like Common Core philanthropically, or you're pushing, for your vision of charter schools instead of better public schools.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, and there's a lot of interesting academic work. Horvath and Powell at Stanford are two leaders on this. There's work that shows that what rich people do when they enter the arena of social change is they change the conversations we all have about change. You take New York City. New York City spends billions of dollars on public education. There's actually not a lot of rich people who can compete with New York City for spending as much on kids' education as New York City does, right? Government is still very, very, very powerful, right? What rich people can do, not for $10 billion, but like for 10 million in a city the scale of New York, is change the conversation about change, right? You can fund reports, you can fund thinkers, you can, put your thumb on the scale so that things like charter schools, which are not really changing the system in any way, acquire a moral glow and have more backing and have people fighting for them. And things like funding public schools more equally, which would threaten your interests, kind of get a little marginalized. So those are some of the problems where, what may seem like perfectly noble acts that I think many of your listeners would say, at least someone's trying. And many of the press are often like, well, at least they're making a difference. It's not always that simple. Automatic gratitude, as Rob Reich, the Stanford political scientist, says, automatic gratitude is a very poor response to elite giving. Gratitude should be one of the responses. But like any other exertion of power, scrutiny and wariness should come first.
Yep. I love that. I love automatic thinking of it not as, hey, if giving happens, you should chill on your gratitude for a second. Say, hey, should we actually be grateful for this? How does it change the system as a whole? What's the actual impact of the giving, etc.? It also sounds like, as you're talking about this, it sounds like someone like me who makes $70K a year or whatever pre-tax, and then gives some of that to charities, and then some of it obviously goes to the government. That you might not have a massive issue with me. I'm clearly playing into the educational industrial complex here with Harvard and MIT and whatever, but correct me if I'm wrong, but is your main issue, and you talk about in this book, this idea of compartmentalization, where you say, hey, people who are part of these companies who make all their money, do all their capitalist stuff, and then afterwards they become a philanthropist, kind of having a stage 1 and then a stage 2 there. It sounds like some of your issue here is like maybe not someone like me, but the people who, once you get above, $1 million, $10 million, $100 million up to the billionaires, those are the people who are really shaping the world here. How would you want to change, thinking about how, whether it's the equity, like someone like Bezos or Zuckerberg, it's the equity structure and kind of the venture capital structure to try to get these black swan 1,000x returns, which makes these people into billionaires. Correct me if I'm wrong, but do you want to change that system and make them not billionaires from the start, to stop it before they get to that point?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the conversations we need to have as a country, that we're actually starting to have for the first time in my lifetime, is, are billionaires a thing we should have?
Yeah.
Are billionaires a thing
my instinct is no.
Right. But that question has been unaskable in American life until recently. I mean, I've been on book tour, on and off since September. And I will tell you, there's a difference between September and February, right? There were more gasps and fewer applauses when I said that in September. And then you had a wave election. You had people like AOC and Elizabeth Warren and others talking about these things in new ways. You have this new tax proposals on the horizon. You really have a new conversation that is starting to happen about, hold on, why do we have billionaires? What are billionaires telling us about ourselves? And in many ways, billionaires are warts on a flawed system.
Hmm.
And they're not, we sometimes kind of personalize these things. This is not about the individual moral failing of rich people, right? This is about the fact that, like, for example, we have way more billionaires per capita than Germany,
Hmm.
right? That is revealing. It tells you stuff about what's going on, right? Just the same way outward topical things in your body tell you about what's going on with your hormones and your deep systems. The fact that we have so many more billionaires per capita than, say, Germany tells you about our taxation system. And the fact that we hugely give advantages to people who make their money on money instead of people who make their money from work. Right? It tells you something about healthcare. The fact that it's a lot easier to prosper when you're not worried about whether your kid breaking their arm is kind of the end of fiscal solvency for your family. It tells you that, in America, we've made a choice to give people benefits if they work 30 hours a week in a certain place and not 29. Well, in Germany, they don't make the 29 versus 30 distinction, and they get a bunch of different outcomes for that. And it probably helps, there be fewer billionaires because people are spending more in companies to take care of people. And so I think the conversation about whether we should have billionaires is really a conversation about what are the kind of policies that allow some people to corner such a large share of the nation's common wealth. Because it's not automatic and it's not a force of nature. When you think about, there being someone who makes, let's say $5 billion in the car industry. Well, there's people who made the parts of those cars. There's people who manufactured the cars themselves, put it together, assembled them. There's people who sold them. There's people who drove them around. There's people who work in the gasoline industry. There's all kinds of people, right? That money could have ended up distributed in any number of ways.
Yeah.
The fact that it all ends up in the hands of people who just are the investors, that's a very particular outcome that is not a natural outcome. That could have gone so many different ways, and it goes the way it did just because of how we happen to organize our policies. And it's a very empowering notion because we can just organize our policies differently and we will get different outcomes.
Yep. So, this is something, I want to push you on this for a bit and ask, so what kinds of policies or laws or regulation would you want to see for something like that? Is something like the B Corporation a step in the right direction? Is it the marginal tax rate or what's kind of the bucket of the set of things that you'd like to see implemented?
Look, in the book itself, I was wary of being a solutionist. Because,
yep.
Because I don't.
That's why I'm pushing you on it.
Yeah, because I think there's a lot of smart people working on it, and I'll tell you I'll answer your question in a second, but I will say first that my theory of change here is that the reason we haven't been able to implement the kinds of solutions I'm talking about is because of the prevalence and dominance of some very well-heeled bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
And not because there weren't people in Washington for the last 20 years who had an idea for how to raise taxes on rich people. I assure you those people have been around. Mm-hmm. None of us have been paying attention to them. Right? I assure you people who actually wanted single-payer health care have been around and banging the same drum for a long time. Look no further than Bernie Sanders. But people weren't listening until, to him, I guess, in 2016. Mm-hmm. Look at people who've been talking about actually empowering women through social policy instead of telling them to basically raise their own hand in a meeting, which is the lean in approach, mm-hmm. Which is trying to convince women that patriarchy is a posture problem. Those ideas have been around for a long time. People weren't listening to them. And so my theory of change here is my job was to slay the bullshit with this book. Right? Yeah. I felt that if I could tear down a set of powerful ideas that have been used to marginalize those kind of solutions, which are there and have been there. If I could slay the bullshit that got in their way, if I could clear that brush, those ideas would have a much better chance of being implemented and being heard. And so I resisted solutionizing for that reason in the book itself, because I and by the way, I have seen that happen. I mean, people I have watched as people, and it's one of the great joys of my life, read the book and see through certain things that I've tried to help them deconstruct. And I watch as people, you see through that, suddenly you think differently about that issue. Suddenly you recognize that, oh, when presidential candidates who are really rich shoot down tax policies, oh, that's not selfless. That's like just repping their own interests. Like once you help people see the moves, a lot of new possibilities come into view. That said, I think we are now in this country having real conversations about a couple areas that I think are very important. I think we need to tax rich people way more than we do right now. We hugely undertax them. They're not paying their fair share. The reality is most Americans, or many, many Americans, pay a wealth tax through property taxes in their home, right? It's just rich people don't have, adequate property taxes on their billion-dollar fortunes. We need to rectify that. I think we need to think about corporate law in America. Why is it legal to have a corporate charter that forces you to run your company only for shareholder benefit, and therefore, it allows you to put your shareholders over the planet, and makes it legal and maybe even required to run your company as ruthlessly as possible to the detriment of the biosphere. Why do we have labor laws that have not kept up with an Uber economy, a gig economy, an Amazon work camper economy? And how do we reinvent labor protection for the world the people now in? How do we actually have collective bargaining and unions? Those kinds of policies. The way I scoop it all up is a lot of the solutions I'm talking about are the kinds of solutions you have after you have a wave of extraordinary private endeavor, much as we had in the first Gilded Age 100 years ago. People were building railroads, steel, all those kinds of things. And you have great fortunes that are built and real problems solved and people enriched. But then you have a bunch of residual problems. You have coordination problems. You have problems of the concentration of ownership. You have problems of, some of those people with big fortunes trying to asphyxiate competition. And it requires a kind of wave of public investment and public action to bring that kind of private striving and those 1,000 blooming flowers, to bring them into some kind of order. And I think we're at another such moment like that today.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. I think, and I agree with you with your instinct with the book to say, hey, you're gonna in the book, not focus on solutionizing, focus on the seeing clearly piece before the responding wisely piece, focus on the sense making aspect to say, hey, this is really what's happening. And then, as you say, if you get people, it reminds me of the paradigm stuff we were talking about earlier, where you say, hey, everybody, remember, this is the paradigm that we live in, and there's all these manifestations of it, whether it's through norms or law or incentives or whatever. And as you say, you just need to get a lot of people to see the world more clearly and to have our sense making better. And then we can start to actually work on some of those problems. So I think I generally agree with that mindset and like some of your proposed solutions. Do you think that a thing that I always wonder about is the balance between having, so I come from the cryptocurrency world to some extent, and so I'm kind of influenced by crypto libertarian and things of that variety. What do you think about the balance between, like, for me personally, I make $70,000 a year, 25% of it goes to taxes to the government, and then 15% or 20% post tax I give to charity. Do you think that there is how do you think about this, like people taking individual responsibility for giving and giving to the public good versus how much, how many taxes there should be? How do you think about this balance between people taking the responsibility on themselves to do it and then versus the government saying, hey, I want to come in and like take a certain percentage? How do you think about the balance between those two things?
Well, look, I'm not telling anybody to not give and help people. That's not my message by any means. And my book's not aimed at people making $70,000 a year, abusing their power and destroying the American dream. So you're going to be okay. But I think what I would think about is when you have people doing the same pattern you described, but at the level of running an investment bank, and often the compromises become much starker. They're recommending ExxonMobil stock. That's how they're making their money. Then they're, with some of that extra money they have, they're giving back to fight climate change.
Mm-hmm.
That feels like a problem to me, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's a lot of that is going on.
Mm-hmm.
That
Mm-hmm.
said, for folks like you or others who are giving, I think there are ways to give that are self-preservational and shore up a bad system. And there's other ways to give, better ways to give, that actually serve to break down a bad system, right? So let's take a couple examples. On education, the most common thing that rich people love to give to is charter schools.
Mm-hmm.
They love them some charter schools. Why? Because it's a way of helping some poor kids you can see and touch in front of you. You know you're doing something. You know you're having impact. Put your name on it maybe. Go to the meeting once a year. Tell your friends at the cocktail party you helped some minority kids get into Yale, as one of the characters in my book says. And at the same time, you don't need to challenge the larger system of class segregation that we have in our public schools in this country, where it is illegal to basically give children schools based on how nice their parents' homes are. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It gives you a way to change something without having to change anything fundamental. So if you were interested in that issue of educational equity, for example, I would urge anybody listening to this to say, okay, instead of giving money to that one charter school, I'm going to fight to end this system. Well, how do you do that? Well, there's a bunch of lawyers. The New York Times wrote a great story about it last year. A bunch of lawyers who are, slowly farming cases in the hope of eventually getting a Supreme Court case that would make it unconstitutional to fund schools by local property taxes and therefore differentially according to the wealth of the area, right? And those lawyers, I assure you, have a lot less plutocratic backing than, fancy little charter schools. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of cause where you'd be giving. Yes, you could support those lawyers. But what you'd be doing, you'd be supporting their effort to make our system work better, right? To win a right for everybody. If they won that case, if they won a Brown versus Board of Education, but for class, which, by the way, has enormous racial correlates, that would affect everybody in the United States overnight, right? Those lawyers could make it unlawful for any child in any public school in America to have less educational funding than any other.
Yep.
Right?
So
there's no philanthropy, there's no private giving that could ever achieve anything on a scale matching that. And those are the kinds of causes that often get underrepresented in our age, but that I think deserve more attention.
Yeah, I agree with you to work at kind of the systemic level and to say, hey, instead of just working at more of the symptom level and saying, oh, let's just fund these things that A, it'll be good for signaling at the cocktail party, and B, it's perpetuating the existing system. Instead, try to work at the systemic level. I agree with that. Do you think? And this to me leads naturally into this question about, in your book, you have this great piece about the Clinton Global Initiative and the globalists more generally, and their one world moral glow, where they're trying to help the world all together. And treating all humans as the same. And I think that and you also talk about some of the backlash there, where people, when they start thinking from this global elite perspective, they start saying no to the people who are in their countries or whatever. For me personally, I would categorize myself as kind of an effective altruist. So someone who thinks about doing the most good, treating all humans the same. How do you think about something like effective altruism? So for example, of the money that I give each month, $120 goes through Give Directly, which is this program directly to folks in rural Uganda for a basic income. How do you think about the kind of the globalist perspective and the effective altruist perspective versus kind of this more like close to home perspective? Would you push back on something like effective altruism?
Well, a couple things. One, there was a part of effective altruism which which very much flowed out of their ideas, which they've now backed away from, which is earning to give. Yeah. Which is kind of like make as much money as you can in whatever way you can, including at a hedge fund or whatever, so that you can maximize how much you give away. And, frankly, it was an idea that had every benefit except being right. And
it's almost exactly what you're talking about. Right. On one hand doing this and on the other hand.
It's a simple accounting error. If you actually understand what it takes to make that much money, you're often causing deprivation on a scale that is, going to exceed the charitable contribution. So even by their own utilitarian calculus, it was not a good bet, not a good deal. That said, let me say something about your kind of the global aspect of that question, which I think is really important. On the one hand, I think it is terrific that our very provincial country, the United States of America, has become way less provincial in our lifetime. That's a major shift in American life. I mean, that's just true of food. I mean, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. There was like a Chinese restaurant when I was growing up. That was food diversity. And now you can eat cuisines from all around the world in a place like Cleveland the way you can in every major American city. And that's a shift that kind of captures a larger shift where we're a more global country, we're more globally aware, we're less siloed, and that's great. And a big piece of that, in terms of giving and caring for the world, is that, yeah, a lot of bright American young people at MIT and Harvard, et cetera, now go to Africa and do projects, and go to India and do projects, and go to China and that's great. And in some ways, people now see their own humanity as not being different from the humanity of people in other countries, and they don't just believe in helping people near them; they believe in helping people far away. And a life is a life is a life, and that is great. However, I think there's a downside to that sometimes has not been acknowledged, and the downside is that there seems to be something important that gets missed about making sure your own community, your home community, the place you belong, is healthy and flourishing first. Sort of like putting on the oxygen mask yourself first before helping someone else. And the reality is, to take one simple example that I write about in the book, if I look at my own social networks, and when I was living in Cambridge some years ago and seeing people at Harvard and MIT in those worlds wanting to do something for the world, I saw many more people, Americans, going to do something in Kenya than showed any interest in Kentucky, for example. Now, on the surface, again, you think that's great. We're enlarging our horizons. We're thinking globally. Fast forward a few years, and now Donald Trump is president. And you say, part of me wonders if more of the best and brightest Americans, and more American institutions, and more journalists had been really focusing on what was happening in Kentucky, and I've used Kentucky broadly and metaphorically, I think we'd be living possibly in a very different world, a less angry country. And a less angry country might not have elected Donald Trump. And if you didn't have Donald Trump as president, I think Kenya would be better off too. Because the Trump presidency has threatened the entire world order and stability and trade and everything, security, everything, right? And so there's a way in which the neglect of one's backyard in the name of some kind of globalism sometimes means that communities become unhealthy in ways that spread problems that you wouldn't have if you were tending to your own place. I think it's amazing that London has become this amazing global capital, and people from everywhere, and people going, and all these international development people who live in London and are constantly on planes helping some other country. But you know what? A lot of people in London had no idea what was going on in the rest of their country. No idea.
Yep.
They didn't know those people, right? So they were on a plane to Sierra Leone more often than they were in North England. Mm-hmm. And what that's now done is hurt both North England and Sierra Leone, because now Sierra Leone's got to live in a world where Brexit's going to happen, right? And where the post-war European order is fracturing. And again, that's not good for anybody. So I think there's a case to be made for making sure your own community is sound. And then worrying about the world on top of that, because the world often suffers when you have unsound communities. I'll give you one final example of that. We think of climate change as a problem of global cooperation, right? Well, who's the biggest, most significant resistor to working together on climate change? I mean, to advancing? The United
States, yeah.
Now, if you look at how that issue polls in America, it polls almost entirely along the lines of education. People with a college degree and more generally do not have a climate denial problem. There's some do, but we don't have a climate denial issue among that cohort. People without a college degree, we do have a big climate denial problem. So now think about climate for a second. Is that a problem of global cooperation, or is that actually an emanation of domestic politics? If we made it easier to go to college in this country. If we had free college or a more affordable college, if we actually made that a priority, we treated college the way we treated high school as a right, it would seem to me we would have a very different, climate change would become like a 70-30 issue. Climate change is a 70-30 issue. The world's politics around climate change would be very different, and our chances of solving it as a world would be very different. That is an example of how looking for the kind of sphere of global cooperation as the place to solve things is often misplaced. First, take care of your home. If we simply did right by our citizens at home in basic domestic policy, this kind of existential climate issue in the world would suddenly become way, way easier.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying, which is yes, there's power in we're less provincial than we are. There's also lots of power in the cost effectiveness of these things that can happen between people who are in extreme poverty in other parts of the world versus people in more developed countries like the United States. And at the same time, we need to think about. And I super agree with. I mean, starting with yourself first. Whether it's with your community and also just as an individual, just being like, hey, where am I at in the world right now? Can I allowing yourself to be a little bit. I don't want to call it selfish, but saying, hey, where am I at? Making sure you have good self-care for yourself, and then starting to move outward from that out into these circles of concern and circles of influence, and saying, hey, how can I start to impact my community positively? So I understand that pushback. One final question I have here before we're starting to get to wrap up mode is, so we've talked a little bit about this awkwardness between you're kind of influencing the influential in the sense that you're talking with important people and you're saying, hey, people, you're being kind of bad here, like this, you're perpetuating a negative system. And there's a really funny example of this at Harvard. Do you want to just tell us this recent award that you got and the headline for it?
Yeah, I mean, I was incredibly honored to find out recently that I got this award from the Humanist Chaplaincy at Harvard, and it's a lifetime achievement award for contributions to humanism and kind of humanist values. And it was very moving to me. My mother's question, as a good Indian mother, was, of course, "Come on, what have you done for a lifetime achievement award?" But that was kind of great. And but the best part of the whole thing was seeing the headline that Boing Boing made of it, which was Harvard humanists troll the elites who fund the Harvard endowment by awarding Anand Giridharadas a prize. So I thought that was great, and I'm very happy to be part of that act of trolling.
It's good, I think, and as you say, I mean, it's funny in the sense that I mean, congratulations on the award, and it's good to receive these things from people in power, and at the same time, as you say, you have this, Harvard has a massive endowment, and they have so much money, and those people funded this, they're funding this prize, and then that prize goes to someone like you who says, hey, I'm pretty sure all these people who funded this prize that they're part of a system that should not exist and that we should try to take down. So I would be interested to know, I mean,
I'm not getting any money. No one's funding a prize. It's just
got it. Okay, sweet. But yeah, I will be interested to know how much, like, if what those people would think about, fund or about giving this prize to someone like you. I think that's interesting. So I guess as a final question here, we also, within the Media Lab at MIT, I'm also part of this digital currency initiative, and we're building money in a weird way from the ground up with the Bitcoin and Ethereum and all these technologies. And there are issues. I mean, there are all kinds of issues. It's very exciting, but one of the issues is income inequality and thinking about the income inequality and the Gini coefficients of Bitcoin and Ethereum. They're awful. And it's like 30% of the top. 30% of all the Bitcoins are owned by the top 100 addresses. And so how should the people in the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency community be thinking about income inequality and thinking about, as they build these new financial systems, how to align them with something like a winners take all, to something like the book that you're pushing here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. Like, I would just step back and say, I'm often fascinated by the priorities of people with technical prowess in our time. It almost seems to me to be something kind of deeply psychological in the escapism of the kind of social escapism of many with those tools. I mean, for example, the fascination with space that many people in Silicon Valley have, feels to me a kind of classic psychological diversion from the very real problems we have down here on Earth, right? I mean,
Yep.
you can say you're going to create an escape hatch for humanity, but the reality is like we have some real problems down here on Earth, and a Mars colony. I'm not sure it's the biggest priority, but it fascinates these folks. You have in the currency stuff you're talking
Yep.
about. Yeah, I'm sure some of this stuff has some potential to empower people, and I'm sure people love to tell that empowerment story.
Yep.
But the reality is, we have not been short on innovation in our era. We have lived in an era awash in innovation. Innovation being the Latin word for new shit. There's plenty of new shit in our time. No, who's going to claim that this has been an age of short on new shit? What this has been an age short on is progress. If progress is defined as most people's lives getting better. So the issues that bedevil us are not the new things. How do we create a new currency? This and that. I mean, all of that's fine. But we have deep political problems of the exclusion of many, of systems that don't work for people. And if you don't actually work on those systems, whatever you invent, whether it's Bitcoin or crypto bit or bitto crypt or whatever, is simply going to sit on top of and accentuate the existing divides.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wish some of the people who are really amazing at thinking about how you can have servers do make work to generate money that's not real.
Mm-hmm.
I wish some of those people were actually smarter about thinking about how you rewrite the social contract, how you actually give workers power so they're not, eating at the dollar store every day, as one couple that I wrote about. How do you actually solve the real problems we have so that most people's lives get better instead of these kind of, projects that often feel more like pleasuring than kind of social progress.
Yep. I think that's a good point. I think that so for anybody who's listening, who's in the cryptocurrency world, to really evaluate whether you think something like Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology, will it actually be helpful for things, or is it just you following your own love of technical abstractions and complex computer science problems or whatever? So I think that's a good place to end here. So first off, for the listeners, you should check out Anand's book, Winners Take All. Just Google it; it's there on the internet. And Anand, how do you, how can people find you on Twitter?
My Twitter name is Anand Writes, AnandWrites. And I apologize in advance for my active tweeting.
It's good. It's active, and honestly, it's once you read the book and once you see Anand's perspective here, you can really. It's one of those things where you can just apply it to. It's kind of like taking a gray pill of some variety, where you're like, okay, most things in the world that are popping up these days, whether it's Howard Schultz, maybe running for president, it's like everything is aligned with this winners take all thesis that you have. So it's a fun follow.
I want to thank Howard for running for president and subjecting himself to ridicule simply to help make the case for my book. It's an enormous sacrifice from a great mediocre American, and I just commend him for it.
Well, hopefully you can give him some of the proceeds of the book, so that'll work. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much.